Hello. You are a nice-looking group. Thanks for coming. Did I hear someone agree? You all agree, yeah. What I'd like to do is read to you for about 17 minutes or so from the first part of the book and then from the back of the book, and then we'll talk. Okay? I might have entitled this book, Constructions of White Americans from Antiquity to the Present, because it explores a concept that lies within a history of events. I've chosen this strategy because race is an idea, not a fact, and its questions demand answers from the conceptual rather than the factual realm. American history offers up a large bounty of commentary on what it means to be non-white, moving easily between alternations in the meaning of race as color, from colored to Negro to African American to black to African American, always associating the idea of blackness with slavery. But little attention has been paid to history's equally confused and flexible discourses on the white races and the old slave trade from Eastern Europe. I use white races in the plural because for most of the past centuries, when race really came down to matters of law, educated Americans firmly believed in the existence of more than one European race. It is possible and important to investigate the other side of history without trivializing the history we already know so well. Let me state categorically that while this is not a history in white versus black, I do not by any means underestimate or ignore the overwhelming importance of black race in America. I am familiar with the truly gigantic literature that explains the meaning, importance, and honest-to-God reality of the existence of race when it means black. In comparison with this preoccupation, statutory and biological definitions of white race remain notoriously vague, the leavings of what is not black. But this vagueness does not indicate lack of interest. Quite to the contrary, for another vast historical literature, much less known today, explains the meaning, importance, and honest-to-God reality of the existence of white races. It may seem odd to begin a book on Americans in Antiquity, a period long before Europeans discovered the Western Hemisphere and thousands of years before the invention of the concept of race. But given the prevalence of the notion that race is permanent, many believe it possible to trace something recognizable as the white race back more than 2,000 years. In addition, not a few Westerners have attempted to racialize antiquity, making ancient history into white race history and classics into a lily-white field, complete with pictures of blonde ancient Greeks. Transforming the ancients into Anglo-Saxon ancestors made classics unwelcoming to African-American classicists. The blonde ancient Greek narrative may no longer be taught in schools, but it lives on as a myth to be confronted in these pages. Before launching the trip back to ancient times, however, it may be useful to make a few remarks about the role of science, or science, of race. I resist the temptation to place the word science, even theories and assertions of the most spurious, pernicious, or ridiculous kind, in quotation marks, for the task of deciding what is sound science and what is cultural fantasy would quickly become all-consuming. Better to note the qualifications of yesterday's scientists than to brand as mere science their thought that has not stood the test of time. I give scholars of repute in their day pride of place in my pages, no matter that some of their thinking has fallen by the wayside. Today we think of race as a matter of biology. But a second thought reminds us that the meanings of race quickly spill out of merely physical categories. Even in so circumscribed a place as one book, the meanings of white race reach into concepts of labor, gender, and class, and images of personal beauty that seldom appear in analyses of race. Work plays a central part in race talk because the people who do the work are likely to be figured as inherently deserving of the toil and poverty of laboring status. It is still assumed, wrongly, that slavery anywhere in the world must rest on a foundation of racial difference. Time and again, the better classes have concluded that those people deserve their lot. It must be something within them that puts them at the bottom. In modern times, we recognize this kind of reasoning as it relates to black race, but in other times, the same logic was applied to people who were white, especially when they were impoverished immigrants seeking work. Let me halt for a moment. Mike, where are you? I am going to need something to mop my brow because it is very hot here. Thank you. Those at the very bottom were slaves. Slavery has helped construct concepts of white race in two contradictory ways. First, American tradition equates whiteness with freedom while consigning blackness to slavery. The history of unfree white people slumbers in popular forgetfulness, though white slavery, like black slavery, moved people around and mixed up human genes on a massive scale. The important demographic role of the various slave trades is all too often overlooked as a historical force. In the second place, the term Caucasian as a designation for white people originates in concepts of beauty related to the white slave trade from Eastern Europe, and whiteness remains embedded in visions of beauty found in art history and popular culture. Today, most Americans envision whiteness as racially indivisible, though ethnically divided. This is the scheme anthropologists laid out in the mid-20th century. By this reckoning, there were only three real races: Mongoloid, Negroid, and Caucasoid, but countless ethnicities. Today, however, biologists and geneticists, not to mention literary critics, no longer believe in the physical existence of races. Thank you. Now you tell me if any of this remains on my forehead and those little bits of white stuff that stick to you. It's not funny. That's true. Where was I? Though they continue to recognize the continuing power of racism, the belief that races exist and that some are better than others. It took some 2 centuries to reach this conclusion, after countless racial schemes had spun out countless different numbers of races, even of white races, and attempts at classification produced frustration. Although science today denies race any standing as objective truth, and the U.S. Census faces taxonomic meltdown, we shall see, many Americans cling to race as the unschooled cling to superstition. So long as racial discrimination remains a fact of life and statistics can be arranged to support racial difference, the American belief in races will endure. But confronted with the actually existing American population, its distribution of wealth, power, and beauty, the notion of American whiteness will continue to evolve as it has since the creation of the American Republic. Now I think I'll read you the whole book. Chapter 1, Greeks and Scythians. Were there white people in antiquity? Certainly some assume so, as though categories we use today could be read backwards over the millennia. People with light skin certainly existed well before our own times. But did anyone think they were white, or that their character related to their color? No. for neither the idea of race nor the idea of white people had been invented, and people's skin color did not carry useful meaning. What mattered was where they lived. Were their lands damp or dry? Were they virile or prone to impotence, hard or soft? Could they be seduced by the luxuries of civilized society, or were they warriors through and through? What were their habits of life? Rather than as white people, Northern Europeans were known by vague tribal names, Scythians and Celts, then Gauls and Germani. But if one asks, say, who are the Scythians? The question sets us off down a slippery slope, for over time, and especially in earliest times, any search for the ancestors of white Americans perforce leads back to non-literate peoples for whom who left no documents describing themselves. Thus, we must shift through intellectual history, which Americans claim as Westerners, keeping in mind that long before science dictated the terms of human difference as race, long before racial scientists began to measure heads and concoct racial theory, ancient Greeks and Romans had their own means of describing the peoples of their world as they knew it more than 2 millennia ago. And inevitably, the earliest accounts of our story are told from on high by rulers dominant at a particular time, for power affixes the markers of history. Furthermore, any attempt to trace biological ancestry quickly turns into legend, for human beings have multiplied so rapidly by 1,000 or more times in some 200 years, and by more than 32,000 times in 300 years. Evolutionary biologists now reckon that the 6 to 7 billion people now living share the same small number of ancestors living 2 or 3 thousand years ago. These circumstances make nonsense of anybody's pretensions to find a pure racial ancestry. Nor are notions of Western cultural purity any less spurious. Without a doubt, the sophisticated Egyptian, Phoenician, Minoan, and Persian societies deeply influenced the classical culture of ancient Greece, which some still imagine as the West's pure and unique source. That story is still to come, for the obsession with purity, racial and cultural, arose many centuries after the demise of the ancients. Now I'm going to read very fast. And here we are at chapter 28. The fourth enlargement of American whiteness. Agitating and media dominating as America's civil rights and Black Power movements were, and those movements helped gel the idea of one white race as opposed to several. Most of the country's white people might have doubted that the upheaval had much to do with them. They might have thought that they were individuals who had succeeded by themselves and that race had always meant Black people, who had not. In fact, by the 1960s, the whole races of Europe discourse had fallen completely out of fashion. And the races of Europe discourse is the part I read you really fast. Books such as William Z. Ripley's Races of Europe, published in 1899 and important for a quarter of a century. Books such as William Z. Ripley's Races of Europe, once a central reading on race, were now remaindered as useless. And if you were Jewish, calling Jews a race would send you straight into the anti-Semitic column. Reminders that Jews and Italians had been labeled as races a generation earlier might have prompted a retort that race was used more loosely in the past. This is true. But every use of race has always been loose, whether applied to black, white, yellow, brown, red, or other. No consensus has ever formed on the number of human races or even on the number of white races. Criteria constantly shift according to individual taste and political need. It was clear, however, that in the olden days, the 20th century, in the olden days, Jim Crow had kept the colored races apart from whites and African Americans largely hidden behind segregation's veil. Shortly after the end of the Second World War, the end of legalized segregation began to propel black people into national visibility as never before. Concurrently, other changes were soon to deeply alter Americans' sense of the very meaning of race. Little noticed at the time, the openness of the mid-1960s went beyond the black-white color line. The Immigration and Nationality, or Hart-Celler Act of 1965, was specially crafted to counter earlier Nordic-minded immigration statutes, especially in terms of Asians. It also allowed for wider immigration from the Western Hemisphere and Africa. Therein lay the seeds of demographic revolution. New immigrants of the post-1965 era, overwhelmingly from outside Europe, were upending American racial conventions. Asians, greatly rising in number, were rapidly being judged to be smarter and eventually to be richer than native-born whites. Latinos formed 13% of the population by 2000, edging out African Americans as the most numerous minority. The U.S. Census, without peer in scoring the nation's racial makeup, had begun to notice Latin Americans in the 1940s by counting up heterogeneous peoples with Spanish surnames and hastily lumping them together as Hispanics. Though an impossibly crude measurement, it survived until 1977. By that point, the federal government needed more precise racial statistics to enforce civil rights legislation. To this end, the Office of Management and Budget issued Statistical Policy Directive Number 15. Here was a change worth noting. In the racially charged decades of the early 20th century, governments at all levels had passed laws to separate Americans by race. Though Jim Crow segregation was supposed to be separate but equal, in practice it worked to discriminate by excluding non-whites from public institutions, whether from libraries, schools, swimming pools, or the ballot box. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 began to change all that, so that by the late 20th century, the rationale for counting people by race had morphed into a means of keeping track of civil rights enforcement. Statistical Policy Directive Number 15 set the terms for racial and ethnic classification throughout American society by directing federal agencies, including the U.S. Census, to collect data according to 4 races: Black, White, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Asian Pacific Islander. Hawaiian was added later as a concession to protests. And one ethnic category, Hispanic Latino, which is not racial. Elaboration was good for civil rights, but it opened the way to chaos. Under these guidelines, the Hispanic Latino classification portended enormous turmoil. Now that there was a non-Hispanic white category, did there not also exist Hispanic white people? Yes, no, and other. Faced with the given racial choices on the census of 2000, fully 42.2% of Latinos checked some other race rather than black or white, throwing nearly 6% of Americans into a kind of racial limbo. In addition, the U.S. Census of 2000 had to increase a deeper and more personal recognition of multiracial identities. For the first time, respondents were allowed to describe themselves as belonging to one or more of 15 racial identities. As so often in the past, adding confusion, the list of races included nationalities. This expansion now allowed for 126 ethno-racial groups, or for purists, 63 races. It did not take much analytical ability to see that any notion of race lay so diluted as to lose much of its punch. And taxonomy was rapidly buckling much further under the weight of interracial sex. Nothing new here. Americans' disorderly sexual habits have always overflowed neat racial lines and driven race thinkers crazy. Asians and Native American Indians had the highest rates of interracial marriage, but others, including African Americans, now often married and had children with people from outside their racial ethnic group. By 1990, American families were so heterogeneous that 1/7 of whites, 1/3 of blacks, 4/5 of Asians, and 19/20 of Native American Indians were closely related to someone of a different racial group. Now that was back in 1990. With some 12% of young people calling themselves multiracial, it is expected that by 2050, 10% of whites and blacks and more than 50% of Latinos, Asians, and Native American Indians will be married to someone outside their racial group, though by 2050 the whole thing may have collapsed. With so many non-white and white Americans marrying willy-nilly, barriers between the progeny of European immigrants have largely disappeared. Among white people, 3 out of 4 marriages had already crossed ethnic boundaries by 1980. A generation later, few white Americans had 4 grandparents from the same country. William Z. Ripley had predicted this outcome in 1908, fearing above all the inharmonious, that's his word, the inharmonious mixing of Italian men and Irish women. But he now would have been forced to reconsider his prediction that such a racial mix would make Americans ugly. We have already seen the lowering of racial boundaries starting in the 1940s, when ethnic began replacing race as applied to the descendants of European immigrants. The use of racial groups for white people has become a moribund category too, partly because white people are so mixed up. Finally, the perquisites of mere whiteness count for less in the present situation, while the stigma of blackness, once just one drop sufficed to curse the white-looking individual, also seems less mortal. Back in the 20th century, white people were assumed to be rich, or at least middle class, as well as more beautiful, powerful, and smart. George Bush did away with that. As citizens and scholars, they said what needed to be known and monopolized the study of other people, with themselves hardly being marked or scrutinized in return. Think of Francis A. Walker and William Z. Ripley, for whom formal education, New England ancestry, and useful connections assured authority. Half a century later, the upheaval of the civil rights era turned the looking glass around, bringing white people under scrutiny. Think of Malcolm X and James Baldwin. Today, the attractive qualities that Saxons, Anglo-Saxons, Nordics, or whites were assumed to monopolize are also to be found elsewhere. After a string of non-white Mrs. America, Jennifer Lopez and Beyoncé Knowles are celebrated as Hollywood beauties. Vijay Singh and Tiger Woods and the Williams sisters, Venus and Serena, dominate elite sports. Robert Johnson, the founder of BET, Bill Cosby, and the financier Alphonse Fletcher Jr. have made millions. Oprah Winfrey is rich and famous. Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice have been secretaries of state, and Alberto Gonzalez, attorney general. Even more to the point of uniting power and beauty, Barack Obama is president of the United States. First Lady Michelle Obama, whose skin color alone would have condemned her to ugliness in the 20th century, figures as an icon of beauty and intelligence on the global stage. None of these individuals is white, but being white these days is not what it used to be. Thus, it is sensible to conclude that the American is undergoing a fourth great enlargement. Although race may seem overweening, without legal recognition, it is less important than in the past. The dark of skin, who also happen to be rich, say people from South Asia or African American or have a Hispanic background, and the light of skin from anywhere who are beautiful, are now well on the way to inclusion. Is this the end of race in America? Is this the end of race in America? If you think yes, put your hand up. 2? 3. 3. If you think no, put your hand up. The noes have it. Is this the end of race in America? We know it is not. At the turn of the 21st century, it was starting to look that way. Back in 2000, remember that? Back in the 90s? In 1997, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists urged the American government to phase out the use of race as a data category and to substitute ethnic categories instead. Geneticists studying DNA, the constituent material of genes that issues instructions to our bodies in response to our surroundings, were also concluding that race as a biological category made no sense. The habit of relating human heredity to the environment may be traced back to antiquity, but early 19th century racial thinkers turned the notion around, deeming race a permanent marker for innate superiority or inferiority. Not until the 1850s did the influence of environment on heredity get rescued with Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Darwin described a world much older than the biblical 5,000 years, reasoning that heredity was not fixed, that generation after generation, living things change in response to their surroundings. Arguments over race in the human genome have subsided of late, leaving us with some intriguing data about personal appearance. Prevailing racial schemes now rest once again on concepts of skin color, hence black and white people. But widely recognized is the fact that not only are black people actually various shades of brown and yellow, but so too are white people, merely somewhat lighter and often with a lot more pink, or if they've been in the sun, a lot more red. Hence the Red Scare. As Blumenbach realized in the late 18th century, one group's skin color shades gradually into another's. There are no clearly demarcated lines. Some people who identify as black may have lighter skin than others who identify as white. Siblings with the same mother and father can display a range of skin colors. Race may be all about pigment, but what makes people's skin light or dark? Skin color is a byproduct of two kinds of melanin, red to yellow pheomelanin and dark brown to black eumelanin, in reaction to sunlight. And several genes interact to make people light or dark, reddish, brownish, or yellowish. Ancient scholars were wiser than they knew when they related skin color to climate. Today's biologists concur. Sunny climates do make people dark-skinned, and dark, cold climates make people light-skinned. How much of which sort of melanin people have in their skin, and to what degree it is expressed, depends entirely over time on exposure to the sun's ultraviolet or UV radiation. Melanin both protects against excessive ultraviolet radiation and allows sufficient UV radiation to enter the body. Too much UV radiation causes skin cancer and lead to death, but UV radiation is crucial for developing fetuses and strong bones. So where are we now? Mapping the human genome elicited initial proclamations of human kindredness across the globe. Then race talk inscribed racial differences on our genes. That talk has not disappeared. But ideally, we would realize that human beings' short history relates us all to one another. To speak in racial terms, incessant human migration has made us all multiracial. Does this mean the human genome or civil rights or desegregation have ended the tyranny of race in America? Almost certainly not. The fundamental black-white binary endures, even though the category of whiteness, or we might say more precisely, a category of non-blackness, effectively expands. As before, the black poor remain outside the concept of the American as an alien race of degenerate families. And I should explain that I have a discussion of the concept of alien races, which was applied to immigrants and their children from Eastern and Southern Europe. And degenerate families were the poor white families slated for involuntary sterilization. A multicultural middle class may diversify the suburbs and college campuses, but the face of poor, segregated inner cities remains black. For some time now, many observers have held that money and interracial sex would solve the race problem, and indeed, in some cases, they have. Nonetheless, poverty in a dark skin endures as the opposite of whiteness, driven by an age-old social yearning to characterize the poor as permanently other and inherently inferior. Thank you. Okay, may the race go to the swiftest. Here we have a race. My book is the work of a historian, not someone who's making policy. Not a what? Not an advocate. Well, I don't know. That's a hard one, too. But let me just say that my goal was not to change the world. So what I would like people to know from reading my book is that whiteness is a concept. It is not something biological and permanent and inherent, intrinsic, and that it has, the ideas about it have changed over time, that whiteness has a history. That's what I wanted. We're going to take another vote. I think you all heard the question as to whether or not more choices produce better families, right? Is that a fair paraphrase of your question? Yes. Everybody understand? Okay. So yes is more choice makes it better. No is more choice doesn't necessarily make it better. You ready? No. This is still yes or no. Yes, more choice makes better families. Okay. No, it doesn't necessarily. Well, this time it's closer. This time, I think the no's still have it. And I'll bet they're going to say, as I heard other people say, it makes it different. Makes it different? It makes it different. Okay. Every 10 years, census categories adjust to take account of what the federal government thinks it needs to count up. So in the middle of, it started off in 1790, and there's a picture in my book of the first census categories, and there was only one race listed, which was white, and it was, I think, in 5 different permutations. And then there were unfree people, who at that point were of various races. And then in the middle of the 19th century, the census added mulatto, I think only for one census. And then in the early 20th century, for white people, they broke white people down into native-born and foreign-born, and you had to say where your parents, maybe even your grandparents were born. So it's changed over time. And if you make a movement, maybe you can get, pink, gray, brownish, you could get some more, variety. Okay. Well, mine's pretty straightforward. I ticked black. My husband ticked white, because as far as we know, he is. But something interesting has been happening. You know, my book came out on the 15th of this month, and since then I've been talking to people, and I hear sort of permutations of this question over and over again, and sometimes people are upset. But I only hear that from people who are upset over the white box, because they know that's the one that the census or somebody wants, the black helicopters or something, wants them to check, and they're not comfortable with it. And I guess, what's happening is that in the 21st century, white people are more and more becoming aware of themselves as having race in addition to just being individuals. And now seeing how awkward a fit a category meant to include millions and millions and millions of people really can be. So we are facing a kind of white dilemma, I think, that's going to be really interesting. That's a really interesting and insightful way of talking about it. Anthropologists have spoken of people addicted to race as people who believe in witchcraft, in that you can never disprove it. If you point to somebody, you disprove their analysis of something that's based on race, then they have a way of getting around it and holding on to their belief. But I think this has been going on for longer than just the last year. And I picked it up. My last book, Creating Black Americans, has a chapter on rap music and hip-hop culture, which is 35 years old now, speaking of things that have a history. And a good bit of the anxiety that comes out there is trying to get black people back in the box. This is what black people are. And a lot of black comedy is based on that. This is what black people are. This is what black people do. And it's a kind of fabricated, unitary image, which I think is the kind of, showing the kind of anxiety that you picked up in the culture at large. So post-segregation, I think Americans generally are trying to figure out who we are according to our traditional bases. And the new bases are so much more about class, because we are living in a country with the most profound inequalities of income and wealth, I think, just about in our history, certainly in our post-slavery history. In the slavery South, the disparities were infinite. But since that time, we've really reached very few people who are very rich, and increasing numbers of people who are increasingly black and brown, who are just scraping by. Yes. Oh, what the appeal is? Yeah, the appeal is that your people, whoever they are, assuming that let's just make you William Z. Ripley for the moment. You well-educated New Englander, wealthy background, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, MIT, and so forth, have a way of explaining why you are beautiful and nice, and they are ugly and poor. Sorts out the world. Thank you. Latinos can be of any race. There are also large numbers of African-descended immigrants who don't necessarily associate themselves with African Americans, native African Americans, whom they see as lazy and inferior. So the whole thing is getting mixed up. Something like only 46% of current immigrants, I think this is like 2008, identify themselves as white, whereas something like 76 to 80% of native-born Americans identify themselves as white. So white is getting to be less popular. We'll see. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I understand now,
sure.
I think. Yeah. I think the fear of loss of power is already underfoot, or in the air, or whatever. without tampering any further with the categories. I think categories tend to lag behind the power arrangements. So, for instance, as Asians become richer, they will also become more beautiful. And as we get all mixed up, the taxonomy will have to somehow catch up to us. One thing that American historians have found very frustrating over the years is that we have a lot of trouble classifying people according to wealth and income, which I think would be a much more useful way of dealing with the inequities of the society. Thank you very much.